Lord Fowler, we looked before the break at the note you'd requested and received in November 1984. The next direct involvement that I think the papers suggest you had in relation to AIDS begins in around June of 1985. And so I just want to look at a couple of documents with you and discuss with you what they indicate. So DHSC 00021114 This is a minute dated the 27th of June 1985. It's from the CMO directed to you, enclosing an update on the AIDS epidemic. And if we go to the third page, we can see the title of the report that the CMO was putting together for you, HTLV3 infection, the AIDS epidemic, and the control of its spread in the UK. And then if we go over the page, we can see the summary of what he was saying, and I think we probably only need to look at the summary. AIDS is the principal end stage of infection with HTLV3 virus, and then there's an estimate of likely numbers infected in the UK. 2, the results of the infection are potentially fatal, no effective treatment for it. 3, there's usually a prolonged incubation period. 4, refers to means of transmission, including blood and blood products. 5, in the UK, most cases of infection that have occurred so far have been in homosexual males and patients with haemophilia treated with infected factor VIII from pooled plasma. And then 6 refers to the possibility of heterosexual transmission. And then 7 picks up on the issue of a public education campaign, if I can put it that way, a comprehensive campaign to reduce the spread of infection, principally by means of education, directed at those especially at risk, is urgently needed. And then he observes that the personal and social consequences of HDLV3 infection to the infected person and his or her family are calamitous. Now, is it right to understand broadly that this is the start of the discussion that you and the Chief Medical Officer then have about a public education campaign? Is that right?
Yes, I think it's the formal start. I think we were talking about it before, but it sets out the case, I think, very clearly. We needed to do a number of things, and I'm not quite sure on the chronology of this, but one of the things we needed to do was we needed to get the ministerial government cabinet arrangements much sharper than they were, because at this time and for a few months afterwards, in fact, you had issues on AIDS which went to the General Home Affairs Committee of the Cabinet. So you took your place in a long queue of issues that they would deal with. And there wasn't any expertise, and people would come along with their general views. I mean, an example of that was was the Prime Minister, who actually intervened on risky sex and said, you know, do we have to have that in the leaflet that goes around? Well, if you didn't have risky sex, I mean, it was difficult to know quite what you were actually talking about. But the point is that we changed that to a specialist cabinet committee. All the major members of the cabinet were on it, and we then dealt with it in that particular way. So it evolved in that shape.
And we'll look at some aspects of the public...
Sorry, yes.
No, that's quite right. We'll look at some aspects of the public education campaign a little later. Just sticking with the summer of 1985,
yep.
If we go to DHSC 0002484_063, this is an update from Dr. Harris to the Chief Medical Officer dated the 4th of July 1983 about heat-treated factor VIII. And if we just look at the handwritten entry at the bottom of the page, which I think we can infer was from the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Harris, can you please translate this into an assurance I can give the Secretary of State next week that no haemophiliacs will be infected in the UK from now on? And then there's a question, what about cryoprecipitate? Just before I ask you about the first of the 2 points, in terms of cryoprecipitate as an alternative means of treatment of factor concentrates, can you recall that being something which there was any discussion about, to your knowledge, prior to this?
No, not in my knowledge. I mean, there may well have been discussion about it, but it certainly wasn't anything which came over my desk or which we talked about.
And then, looking at the first part of the handwritten note, it looks as though the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald, wants to be able to say to you, well, insofar as haemophiliacs are concerned, there should be no further infections.
Because we had got to a very important stage. We got to the stage where we were having screening, and we were also having heat treatment. So there was one question, should you have both? And we said, yes, we should have both.
Yes, we don't in fact have screening yet. That's middle of October. But
okay, so we've got heat treatment.
And then if we look at DHSC 0002484_061, this is a further minute from the Chief Medical Officer to Dr. Harris, 8th of July. Can you let me have a note as soon as possible on the current position about the infectivity of these two preparations as administered in the UK? Also, how we can ensure that no infected factor 8 and factor 9 is used here, and by what date this can be achieved? I gave the Secretary of State an assurance that I would look into this forthwith, and will be seeing him again towards the end of next week. So is it right to understand from these interactions that, for whatever reason, you are now directly involved with wanting to know about the position of haemophiliacs? And
the whole AIDS issue and everything around it, yes.
And was there anything in particular that had triggered you wanting to become directly involved in this issue in 1985 in circumstances where previously you hadn't been?
Yes, there was. It was quite clear that unless someone from the cabinet, unless a cabinet minister like myself took charge, we weren't going to make much progress. I've already mentioned some of the issues some of the challenges that we had, we can't. There were some of the Prime Minister's interventions. You needed someone with some. I'm sorry to put it this way, but some weight in cabinet to be able to make the case and put the points. And unless you had that, you weren't going to make any progress. It wasn't something that could be done at a Minister of State level. It could only be done at a cabinet level and with other cabinet ministers, because they were the people that you needed basically on your side if you were going to change policy and if you were going to extend policy. And so that's what we aimed for, and that's what we achieved.
Does that beg the question, Lord Fowler, as to whether you should have been directly involved at an earlier stage so that you could bring your energies and your seniority to the issue of risks to the groups who were at risk, including haemophiliacs?
I mean, obviously one could have done that, but I did. I was also in the, 5th year of my reign, I use the word in an exaggerated form, at the DHSS. So I had a lot of experience by this stage, whereas earlier on I was, in fact, learning the job up to a point. And so it was, I think it was a natural progression. But again, I come back to the fact that we had a new Chief Medical Officer. And the new Chief Medical Officer and I worked as a tandem on this. And with another great man called Tony Newton, who was Minister of Health after Ken Clarke left and was promoted. and we three kind of worked together on it. But it was the coming together, I think, of Donald and myself that really changed the things.
If we then just look at two further documents from July of 85, the first is at DHSC 302327_032. This again is a document from the Chief Medical Officer to you, headed Action on HTLV/AIDS. There are 3 key items for discussion: control of further spread of HTLV3 infection, confidentiality of the results of HTLV3 testing, provision of further resources in addition to current PESC bid for counselling and other aspects of health education. And then there was a recommendation of setting up an in-house small multidisciplinary steering group. And then if we just go over the page, go to the 3rd page, in fact, please, Seamus, of this document. We can see there's a short sub-paragraph on haemophiliacs and their families at the bottom of this page. UK and foreign heat-treated factor VIII is available in sufficient quantity for all UK haemophiliacs. Further infection of this group should not therefore take place, provided that non-heat-treated material is not used. Heat-treated factor IX produced at BPL Austria is expected to be available in October for sufferers of Christmas disease. Heat-treated foreign factor IX is at present available for named patients on prescription. And then there are 2 handwritten entries, or scribbles. One says, all sero tested by end of presumably August, and then the bottom says clinical judgment, balancing dangers involved. As I understand your statement, Lord Fowler, that's not your handwriting and you don't know whose it is.
No, it's much too legible for mine.
And then if we go over to the top of the next page, the action in relation to haemophiliacs at this point is ask Professor Arthur Bloom, Chairman of the Haemophilia Centre Directors, to contact all the directors, informing them of the availability of heat-treated factor VIII. And then if we just go to DHSC 40514, this is the 30th of July, the Chief Medical Officer writes to you again. In the halfway down the 2nd paragraph, it says, I'm arranging that a letter will go to all haemophilia centre directors in order to draw their attention to the availability of heat-treated factor VIII and the need to avoid using any commercial unheat-treated factor VIII which may remain from 1984. I am satisfied, look at the next paragraph, I'm satisfied that it's extremely unlikely that any patients with haemophilia treated in the UK will in future be infected with HTLV3 virus. And then Sir Donald, one assumes, has added this in handwriting, but sadly, a very high proportion of the haemophiliac population already are infected due to previous use of non-heat-treated factor VIII. Just pausing there, it might be said that writing to haemophilia centre directors at the end of July 1985 about heat-treated factor VIII is closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. It's somewhat late in the day, bearing in mind heat-treated concentrates had been discussed at the end of 1984. Do you know why this was only being done at this point in time?
I imagine it was being done and because it was a very significant milestone. I mean, it was saying, in effect, that heat-treated factor VIII was now available for everybody, and that the risk of further infection, as far as AIDS was concerned, had been very substantially reduced. So I think it would be extraordinary if the Chief Medical Officer hadn't made note of that, and that everyone else, I imagine they were beginning to understand that in any event, but everyone else should know that as well.
Pick up on the question of screening. Now, again, as I understand your statement, although you became involved in an exchange of correspondence with Nick Edwards, the Secretary of State for Wales, on this issue, you yourself were not, I think, involved in the ministerial decision-making in relation to the introduction of the screening test. Is that correct?
I think that is correct. The issue there was it not, was whether you went with a not complete test or whether you waited a couple of months to get the proper test, the full test.
Yes, I mean, I think if we just put some dates on it, first of all, screening was introduced in around the middle of October 1985. That's certainly the ministerial announcement from Barney Hayhoe by this time is, I think, the 14th of October 1985. Other countries, they're referred to in the documents you've exhibited, but Australia, States, Netherlands, for example, had introduced screening earlier. The decision the department took was to undertake its own evaluation, two-stage evaluation of the screening tests, to satisfy itself that it had the most reliable tests.
To avoid mistakes.
Well, I think that certainly seems to have been part of the thinking. Now, the Chief Medical Officer, if we look at WITN 0771101, this is June 1985, and he was writing to John Patton on the issue of screening of blood donation. So the Chief Medical Officer seemed to think it was a finely balanced decision, but was in favour of the suggested line. And then he explains his thinking in the next paragraph, and then says in the third paragraph, ministers should recognise, however, that support for a different view is likely to appear in the medical press. And there's reference to a letter from Professor Bloom, which was published in the medical journals in June of 1985. And that considerable public pressure would develop if, in the meantime, a case of AIDS develops in a recipient of UK blood. Such a case or cases is likely to occur sooner or later. Now, I think perhaps we can pick up the counter-argument, the argument in favour of introducing testing earlier, just by reference to one document. Shomek, it's HSOC 0002441. This is a document entitled Haemophilia and Transfusion, the Clinician's Dilemma. And it's authored by Dr. Peter Jones, who was a haemophilia clinician and reference centre director. And if we go to page 8, we can pick up his thoughts towards the bottom of the page. Last 9 lines or so, he says this: despite the difficulties which have arisen in the United States in the first months of their universal application of HTLV3 tests, and my own feeling as a clinician is that we've been wrong in this country to await the development of a more reliable test. And then he refers to a Punch cartoon. And then at the bottom of the page, it's easy to point to the false results encountered by the American tests and use them, together with the low incidence of positive tests as a whole found in the United States, as an argument for not testing individual donations until we are absolutely sure of what we are doing. But turn the argument round and you have a different picture. Surely with a disease like AIDS, it's imperative to try to give some measure of protection to anybody at risk, no matter how small that measure. So that's the counter-argument, Lord Fowler. I raised that with you because I think in your statement, you'd seen a number of these documents, not that particular one from Dr. Jones at that stage. And then if we look at your statement, so if we could have Lord Fowler's statement, Shomek, page 149. In paragraph 6-100, you refer to the, if we pick it up five lines down, although I was not involved in the detail of this is an area where we, in my view, justifiably relied on the expert medical advice being given on the balance to be struck between speed of implementation and reliability. looking at it now, while it may be said that lives may have been saved by the most rapid introduction of some testing, the concern about unreliable results and engendering a false sense of security has forced too, as it did at the time. Introducing a testing system involving less reliable testing, particularly if it had a tendency towards false negatives, would risk more cases slipping through the net. And then you say this: I do not feel that I am able to comment more meaningfully in more detail on whether the balance was struck correctly, whether at the time or viewed with all the benefits of hindsight. Having now seen, in addition to what you saw at the time of your statement, the observations from Dr. Jones, does it remain your view that you're not able to comment more meaningfully on whether the balance was struck correctly?
Yeah, I think the balance was struck correctly, in the sense that I think I would back the judgment of the Chief Medical Officer, very expert in this area, and who was completely dedicated to it. And I don't know Dr. Peter Jones in quite the same way. I'm sure he's very distinguished. But I think that the Chief Medical Officer is right, and certainly right from the point of view that if you introduce a test which can go wrong, then you're playing with fire, because it means that, and remember, the press at this time were not 100% in favour of much of what was taking place. But I mean, a case which went wrong would be headline news, and you would lose quite a lot in that, because you would lose confidence, public confidence in the system. So we're not just talking about medics talking to each other, we're also talking about the public as well, and we're talking about haemophiliacs, and we're talking about other patients as well. So I think that the Chief Medical Officer was absolutely correct that it was not a vast delay. I think a couple of months, something like that. But I think it's completely correct that he should do his utmost to get the best and correct measure.
Those are your views, as I understand it, after the event, because at the time, subject to the correspondence that you then had later on with Nick Edwards in, I think, around October of 1985, this wasn't a matter that came to you for your decision as secretary?
No, it wasn't, but I think I did write to Nick Edwards at the time, and Nick, who was a great friend, had, I think, argued, had he not, that some test is better than no test, or words to that effect. And I had challenged that, and the whole department actually had challenged that. So I think my view is consistent.
Does it not concern you that the UK was slower than other countries to introduce testing? As I say, I think Australia, USA, Netherlands had all introduced testing by June of 1985, and France and Germany were about to introduce it. Is that not something which troubles you as to why the UK was taking a slower and different course?
Well, it was taking a certain course. I'm all for trying to eradicate the risk. And if you want international comparisons, you compare our record on AIDS with any of the countries that you have just mentioned, and you'll find that our record comes out probably better than any of them. So that was the policy of prudence that we carried out, and you have lighted on one particular issue where we are behind. I can give you quite a number where we were 100 miles ahead.
If we just, for the sake of completion, look at the correspondence with Mr. Edwards, perhaps not so much for what it tells us about screening, but to cast some light, I think, on the interactions between the department and the Welsh office. If we go to DHSC 0044118, please. This was in response to a letter you'd written to the Prime Minister in September of 1985 about setting up a ministerial steering group. And we can see Mr. Edwards writing on the 8th of October 1985, saying this in the second paragraph: the initiative to set up a ministerial steering group to direct work in the wider implications of AIDS is timely, since my department has responsibilities for housing, education and employment as well as health services. I'm particularly conscious of the need to address these wider issues. And he explains that there'll be Welsh Office representation. Then he says, you mentioned in your letter the establishment of an interdepartmental team of senior officials to make recommendations to the steering group. The Welsh Office will need to be represented on that too at a senior level. This would go some way to promote the close liaison that is needed between our departments, both on the wider implications of AIDS and on those aspects relating primarily to health services. And just pausing there, I think this was the one concrete example you were able to give in your witness statement of the relationship between the department and the Welsh Office. Was this fairly typical as far as you can recall?
Well, it was typical of the relationship with Nick. Nick was forthright in his views, and sometimes one might have thought rather over forthright. He had particular issues that he felt very strongly on, and expressed it in that way. But we had constant, I won't say constant, but we had regular conversations as Secretary of State. And if Nick was concerned, he would certainly let me know. And he was also very sensitive about the fact that, as you see from this, that Wales should be represented. The Welsh voice should always be heard, which is absolutely fair. That's what Secretary of State should be.
And then there's a reference in the next paragraph to the testing or screening kits.
Yeah.
If we can pick that up in his later letter at ARCH 5068. This is 18th of October 1985. Again, it's from Mr. Edwards, the Secretary of State for Wales, to you. And he sets out some issues about the test kits and the evaluation of those test kits. In the first paragraph, explains he's had a presentation by his officials. And then the second paragraph, he says, be that as it may, I accept that even unreliable testing is better than no testing at all. So that's the letter he wrote to you. If we can then just go to WITN 0771090. We can see this is a response from the department preparing a draft reply, and paragraph 2 deals with the issue about the evaluation of the tests. But I just wanted to draw your attention to and ask you about paragraph 3, if I may, Lord Fowler. It says a fairly robust response is proposed. The introduction of a screening test after a rigorous 2-stage evaluation is one of the government's most notable achievements in response to the challenge of AIDS. And then this, it's highly undesirable that another member of the government should have such a negative perception of this achievement. Private attitudes can easily become reflected in the tone, if not the content, of public statements and correspondence. Damning the test by faint praise could lead to the very failure in public confidence which Mr. Edwards wishes to avoid. So there appears to be a concern there being expressed by your officials that there should not be criticisms or concerns publicly expressed by other ministers. Is that right?
Well, that's one way of interpreting it. The other way of interpreting it is that the Welsh department were fully part of the policy group that were looking at this, and went along with it. And then to find the Secretary of State not actually taking another path was a little surprising. But Nick was a fairly robust response as proposed, we say, but Nick was very robust as well. I mean, he would accept that. And he did, I was going to say fly off the handle, but that's not true. He did certainly express himself very forcefully on these issues. But I don't think, I think this is just what you might expect between from a department, the Department of Health, who believed very firmly in what they were doing, to what they regarded as a not very learned intervention. And if I could see that his quote again, can I see that quote again, the first quote here? No, before that.
The letter from...
yes, from Nick.
That's ARCH 5068.
Yes, where does he say?
It's the beginning of the second...
Oh, yes, I see. He's basically saying unreliable testing is better than no testing at all. Well, we disputed that. And so did the other departments disputed that. That wasn't the view. And in fact, frankly, when you get to the end of this correspondence, he actually basically accepts that we were right and he was wrong, but he didn't quite put it in those ways.
Well, yes, I think just so that we can see your response, which was at DHSC 302482_126. Sorry, DHSC 0002482_126. You say in the first main paragraph, concerned that you've obtained from your officials such a negative impression of the government's achievements in this area. This is all the more surprising since your officials have participated fully in the forums, which gave us the medical and scientific advice on which our policy has been based. And then you say this, perhaps the most worrying misconception is the statement unreliable testing is better than no testing at all. This is the complete opposite of our thinking. We have based policy on the firm conviction that unreliable testing would be disastrous and would engender a false sense of security. This was the reason why we delayed the introduction of screening until we were satisfied that the tests to be used were sufficiently reliable. And then you talk about the two-stage evaluation. Now, whether that was the right judgment is obviously a matter for submission in due course, Lord Fowler, and for decision by the chair. But as I understand your witness statement, what you say here was essentially based upon the advice that you were being given at this point by your officials. You say in your statement you'd have relied essentially on what the Chief Medical Officer or Deputy Chief Medical Officer were telling you.
But I would say, I would just add this. I mean, I think that Nick made a point. He suddenly, he did tend to pick up issues and then be fairly forceful about them. But I think if he was here today, I think he would say, pass on. This wasn't an issue that I got right, and I wouldn't wish to pursue it. That would, I think, I hope I'm not being unfair to him, but I think that he wouldn't wish to be judged by that particular statement. I may be wrong.
Can I just intervene at this stage? I want to see this correspondence in context. Can I tell you what I think the context is and what how I should understand the letters which have just been set out? On the 14th of October, 1985, universal screening was introduced. So when Nick Edwards wrote on the 18th of October, he was writing 4 days after a test had been introduced. That test had been evaluated. It was, quote, satisfactory. In other words, it wasn't 100% accurate. I suspect few tests are. But it was okay for use. He was saying, when he said some test is better than no test, what he was really saying wasn't expressing that principle as a principle for action, but he was saying this test isn't reliable enough. It's a poor test. And I can understand, am I to understand then that the department's reaction to that was one of a bit of umbrage because they thought it was the best test they got, and to call it poor was likely to undermine confidence in the testing that was the best that could be done.
I think that's certainly one way of viewing the correspondence. So
I'm not sure it is the right way of viewing it.
Well, that's what I'm asking, really.
Yeah, because I think basically I think what he is saying is to challenge the whole basis of let me start again. What the department was saying, what the health department was saying, is that we should take this, we should not take, if you like, an interim step, but we should go on until we are absolutely satisfied. Now, that wasn't a process which was going to take several years. That was a process which might take several months. And I think, in the end, my memory is that Nick was entirely happy with that and withdrew from this position.
I think my point was this, that if screening was introduced as it was, from my understanding, on the 14th of October,
Yeah.
At that stage, the department was satisfied that the test was appropriate.
Yeah.
So, at that stage, when Mr. Edwards wrote to you saying a poor test is better than no test at all, he wasn't advocating the introduction of a poor test because there was a test. His policy, if it was a poor test, it was being used. What he was saying was the test isn't entirely reliable, but I suppose it's the best we can do. That's the sort of way that at the moment I'm looking at this correspondence.
Well,
it's not quite the way you've been questioned about it, which is why I'm asking if I got this right.
Well, I'm not sure you are right, but I would like to, if I might, I'm sure this is unusual, but I'd like to actually check the correspondence on this and perhaps write to you on it, because just to get it absolutely clear.
That would be very, very helpful, and in due course, if you do, we'll publish whatever
Thank
it
you
is
so
that
much.
you
Yeah.
have to say.
Yeah.
Yes, and just for the sake of completeness, if we go back to Mr. Harris's minute of the 31st of October 1985, which is at DHSC 010103. No, sorry, it's not. Yeah, thank you. So WITN 0771090. WITN 0771090. I draw Lord Fowler's attention to the third paragraph because of what it might or might not indicate about the relationship between government ministers, but the second paragraph indicates that Mr. Edwards had been shown the draft report of the evaluation in the BTS of the two screening tests. And so provides a little more context.
Yeah. Perhaps I can try and sum this up.
Yes.
Can I? Knowing Nick Edwards as well as I did, I think he will be intrigued to see how much is being read into his letter. But there we are.
Yes. I mean, again, so that there's no misunderstanding, Lord Fowler, I've asked you about it really less because of the substantive content,
Yeah.
but more because it's one of the few examples we currently have of exchanges at a ministerial level between the Welsh Office and the Department of Health on issues relating to AIDS, until we get to the Cabinet subcommittee that you referred to when Mr. Edwards was in attendance.
But it was quite a good relationship. I mean, it was a robust relationship, I think, to use the word, because Nick was a very robust politician. And, but it was never anything less than totally open and honest.
Can I move then from screening to a discrete issue about making available funding to haemophilia centres for counselling in relation to AIDS. And if we go to your witness statement, Lord Fowler, at page... well, it starts bottom of page 163, but we can pick it up at 164. At paragraph 6.127, you deal with the question of funding that was made available, and you've itemised there a range of awards that were made not specifically for haemophilia centres or for individuals with bleeding disorders, but more generally in the range of counselling services. And then, bottom of that page, subparagraph 4, you refer to funding for the Thames regions. Again, that's not specific to haemophiliacs. And then very bottom of the page, funding that would be used to support the counselling work of the haemophilia reference centres. And we can see there the figure, 4 lines down, £90,000 for the haemophilia reference centres. I'm looking at your statement really to avoid the need to go to all the documents you refer to. Essentially, September 85, there's a funding of £90,000 for haemophilia reference centres. And then we can see there is subsequently funding, which you refer to in subparagraph 6, of £270,000 to be provided to 6 haemophilia reference centres to continue support for specialist counselling services they'd set up. And then you describe that in a parliamentary answer. I don't need to take you to that. What I wanted to do was just ask you in relation to 2 matters on the provision of funding. The first is, when it talks about funding for counselling, did you have any understanding of what was meant by counselling for haemophiliacs infected with HIV at that point in time?
Yes, I think so. It was, it was in broadest terms, how to cope with that condition. Rather important advice to be given. And if you go to my book on this, you will see that I think that we should have developed even more the advice and education side of our programme here.
The inquiry has had a lot of evidence to the effect that counselling in the form of ongoing psychological support was not, for the most part at least, available to those who were infected, indeed either through blood products or through blood transfusion. I wonder if I can just show you the minutes of an eager meeting and see if it casts any light on the matter. It's WITN 0771132. Minutes of an eager meeting on the 1st of October 1985, and you'll see from the list of attendees, Lord Fowler, that in fact Barney Hayhoe, Minister for Health, attended that meeting. But if we go to page 5, bottom of the page, there's a description of counselling, not specific to haemophilia centres, in the last few lines. So one of those attending the meeting, it's not entirely clear from the minutes, but it may be the Professor Geddes. In the last 5 lines is this: he undertook counselling himself but had not been on the St Mary's course. The counselling he gave basically consisted of an explanation of the significance of a positive test and its health implications, and secondly, the risks to other people. Many patients asked if they could return with their relatives for further counselling. And Lord Fowler, again, the evidence that the inquiry has heard for the most part suggests that to the extent that counselling was made available at this time, it was of this order. This is what a test means, and this is how you might not avoid passing it on. Not counselling in the sense of ongoing support and psychological support. Do you recall that matter being considered around this time at all within the department as to what this money might actually fund?
I'm sure there were meetings on it, and I know certainly in my book in 1991, where I advocated an inquiry, public inquiry, into this whole area. I did say that there should be a searching inquiry into the whole area of health education, which will examine the effectiveness of our current approaches, and that what AIDS shows, that health education is not some rather cosy marginal activity, but is a way we have of preventing human disaster, but is also, actually, although that isn't written there, is also a way of counselling people on how to live with the disease.
Just to complete, I hope, the picture in relation to specific funding to haemophilia centres for counselling.
Yeah.
If we go to CBLA 00023744, we have a report of the Social Services Committee, problems associated with AIDS, and we can see there's a date towards the bottom of the page, ordered by the House of Commons to be printed 13th of May 1987. Now, you and I think Tony Newton both gave evidence before the Social Services Committee, along with a number of others. Shemik, can we go to page... I think it's probably 99. Previous page, sorry. So we just pick it up at the bottom of the page, paragraph 162. It says the DHSS has provided each of the 7 haemophilia reference centres in England with £40,000 to £45,000 a year for the last 2 years to cope with the extra burden of work placed on them by HIV. And I think that's a reference to the 270,000 figure. We can no doubt check that. The Welsh and Northern Ireland offices have provided similar levels of funding for the centres in Cardiff and Belfast. However, in Scotland, the Edinburgh Centre has received only temporary support from the Lothian Health Board, and the Glasgow Centre has had a small counselling research project funded by SHHD. There's been no support comparable to that in the rest of the UK. We hope this discrepancy will be rectified as soon as possible. And then this recommendation, we recommend that all haemophilia centres have the requisite funding to enable them to cope with the extra work AIDS and HIV entail for them. Ideally, this money should include specific provision for a fully trained AIDS counselling service. Two questions, Lord Fowler, if I may. The first is, it would appear from this that the funding from the department went solely to the reference centres. We know that there were many other smaller haemophilia centres where individuals had been infected with HIV who didn't receive funding. Are you able to assist us in understanding why funding was limited to the reference centres?
Because we were still working in an area, which, I mean, we always are going to be working in, where funds were limited, and the priorities we made were haemophilia centres. But if I had more money, we could have done more things. But, I mean, frankly, these money questions, I mean, I do really think you should ask the Treasury about this. I mean, it's always the health ministers who get blamed, but the health ministers have often been making the case for exactly the things that you're asking, but the Treasury have been saying no. So, I mean, I hope you'll bring a few chief secretaries in front of you and actually ask them why they didn't provide the money.
So do I, Lord Fowler. The second point in relation to Scotland. Now, obviously, Scotland was not, for the reasons you've explained, your direct responsibility. But
Not at all.
Do you recall? I don't think there's any documents that would assist in aiding your memory in this regard. Do you recall any discussions or representations in relation to the position of the Scottish?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
And then I think the formal response to this report then came after you left office, so I don't think I can sensibly ask you about that. But you set out in your statement, and it really picks up on the point you've just made about the Treasury, Lord Fowler, at it's paragraph 6.144, so I'll get the page reference. No, sorry, wrong paragraph. Page 165, please. So paragraph 6.128, you pick up on the issue of the funding to the haemophilia reference centres. And then you refer at the bottom of the page to that eager meeting which Barney Hayhoe attended to talk about the case for additional funding. And you say this: he explained that we'd made a strong case for additional monies and would continue to argue for the need for more resources. Over the page, my general recollection, which is not tied to this specific period, is that AIDS was not seen as a priority in the Treasury, or for that matter at number 10. Are you able to assist us in understanding why you think AIDS was not seen as a priority by the Treasury or indeed the Prime Minister?
Well, obviously for the Treasury took the view that they weren't in business for actually spending more money. If they could make reductions, they would. And they're not a social department. As I said yesterday, I mean, I'm afraid there were some of the ministers who took some credit for the fact that they were not spending money. And that, I mean, most of the AIDS campaign, remember, we had to do ourselves out of the resources inside the department. So we took the money from various parts of the department. We didn't get extra money from the Treasury. Treasury were completely stony-faced as far as all that was concerned. And of course, what they were totally reassured by was that number 10 and the Prime Minister didn't take it as a priority either. So if the Prime Minister had taken it as a priority, doubtless things would have been slightly different, but she didn't. And there's no reason to actually beat about the bush as far as that is concerned. That is something that she would, I think, concede herself. And I think, I can't remember now what period it was. I mean, I remember, for example, even things which wouldn't cost money. I remember we wanted to do a ministerial broadcast on AIDS. The committee under Willie Whitelaw and all the other cabinet ministers there agreed, but that needed the say-so of the Prime Minister. Unusually, ministerial broadcast needs her say-so, and she took me in, asked me in, well, actually I asked myself in, on New Year's Eve, of all times, and said that she wasn't prepared to give that authority. So no ministerial statement was made. We had the offer of a ministerial statement over the whole of television, and the opposition, Michael Meacher, to his great credit, had agreed that he didn't want any reply. So it was absolutely cut and dry, but it was vetoed by number 10. So that was I mean, I've said it was not seen as a priority in the Treasury, or for that matter at number 10. That is exactly what the position was.
I want to come on to ask you about a little more about the health education campaign and certain aspects of it. But before we look at any of the documents relating to that, can I ask you to go to your statement, we'll put it up on screen again, page 20. You describe in paragraph 0.42 bigotry and prejudice of some sections of the public, fueled by a number of public figures. And you've given some examples, and you correctly say that these are examples drawn from your book, AIDS Don't Die of Prejudice. I'm just going to read them out for those who haven't had the advantage of reading your statement beforehand. The then Chief Constable of Manchester, James Anderton, said that homosexuals, drug addicts and prostitutes who had HIV/AIDS were swirling in a human cesspit of their own making. Lord Monckton argued that those with HIV should be quarantined and kept away from the general public.
All those with HIV, incidentally.
Yes, yes. Woodrow Wyatt, a close political friend of the Prime Minister, told his News of the World readers the start of AIDS was homosexual lovemaking. Promiscuous women are vulnerable, making love to promiscuous bisexuals. They then pass on AIDS to normal men. And then Alfred Sherman, an influential political figure on the right, again close to the Prime Minister, wrote to the Times saying that AIDS was a problem of undesirable minorities, mainly sodomites and drug abusers, together with numbers of women who voluntarily associate with the sexual underworld. And you talk in the next paragraph of that being the face of prejudice and stigma with which you were contending. Do you consider that that bigotry, that prejudice, played a role in the decision-making in terms of funding and the lack of enthusiasm from the Treasury or Number 10 for funding?
I don't know about that. I mean, I think that Prime Minister's view on AIDS was of more long-holding than that. I'm not sure she's been influenced by that. The Treasury will use any argument that comes along for reducing spending. I'm not sure if they did, to be perfectly honest, on this one. But perhaps I could actually make this point about the campaign itself, which was, I mean, this is behind all this, which alleges that the campaign led to stigma of people with HIV. We did, unusually, we're about the only people who did it, we did, after the AIDS campaign, we asked the British Market Research Bureau to do a survey of public opinion. There were 4 waves of interviewing between 86 and 87. And what that showed was that the people who claimed to know anything about AIDS recently, the proportion more than doubled from 44% to 94%. It went on, attitudes to advertising were generally favourable. The proportion claiming to know more about AIDS than a couple of months ago rose from 38% to 70%. And it concluded that the advertising campaign substantially achieved the objectives of educating the public and influencing the climate of opinion on a basis for behaviour modification. So, frankly, we may have made mistakes, but I don't think there was too much in that campaign that I feel inclined to apologise about, because I think it was probably one of the most successful public education campaigns since the war. I want to ask you a little more about some aspects of that answer, Lord Fowler. But before we do that, just to give a handful of dates, I don't think we need to go to too much by way of documents. I think we can see from the various documents you've referred to in your witness statement that the public education campaign essentially commenced with an exercise with leaflets and posters in 1986. Well, Leaflets, I think, mainly, wasn't it, in 1986? The real poster campaign came, yeah, you're quite right. No, sorry, I'll start again. Beginning of 1985 we started with, I think, leaflets and some advertisements. Then we moved into 86, and we, as you rightly say, we had leaflets and we had posters. And the reason that we did that was that with the creation of this special cabinet committee, we were able to get this proposal through, because previously it had been held up by people who said, oh, people are going to be very offended to get a communication through the letterbox and things of that kind. So we were able to do that, and with the advertising and with the postering, I think was particularly effective. Again, I have to say, it was all financed inside the department. And we'll just, I think we can just look at one document to see what the purpose was, or what it was said to be the purpose of this public education campaign. So if we go to DHSC 010517.
This is 7th of March 1986. I attach a briefing package and a draft letter for the Secretary of State to send to MPs. And if we go over the page, it says, I'm writing to you and all other members of the House to tell you about the UK public information campaign which will be launched shortly. Bottom of that page says, in the absence of a cure or vaccine, either of which may take many years to develop, the measures available to control the spread of this dreadful disease are limited. The one measure which is unanimously advocated by the experts is a high-profile long-term public health information campaign. This is something the World Health Organization is also recommending to governments around the world. And then if we go to the next page, since December 1985, when I announced my intention to mount a campaign, work's been progressing on the development of campaign proposals to allow a spring launch, reference to EGA's involvement and representatives of at-risk groups. Campaigns aimed at homosexuals and drug abusers are needed but are not enough. A wider public information campaign in layman's language is required to provide basic facts and dispel myths about AIDS and the infection which underlines it, alert high-risk groups to the danger of infection and encourage them to change their lifestyles, emphasise to the general public the dangers of sexual contact with people who may be infected. And then you go on to say about such a campaign will have to be sensitively balanced if it's to provide the basic information in a form which people will be prepared to read and will understand. And as I understand the rest of that paragraph, when you talk about sensitive balance, you're going to be putting in references, or you wanted to put in references to specific sexual activity, but it needed to be carefully worded so as to not to offend or put people off.
Yes, much more important that we shouldn't actually offend or otherwise alienate people who, through absolutely no fault of their own, had HIV. That was really the sensitivity that we had in mind. I think I was slightly past the stage of worrying whether I was offending people in the sense of the advertising that we were doing, because it was, from the very first, things like risky sex and things of that kind, we were all into that, and we did change. I mean, we were doing things that no other government no other government department had ever done in terms of health advertising. What I would like to stress, however, is that in the advertising itself, Donald Atchison and I, and indeed Tony Newton, we went through every advertisement line by line. There are some things that we cut out. I don't think we ever inserted, but we did cut out things which, if we felt that was going to in any way harm people outside. So we had to somehow get the balance. We had to warn the public, but we also had to try to prevent the advertising from giving the impression that we were condemning all those with HIV.
If we just go back to the top of the page,
Yep.
We can see it says, the sentence I read before, members of the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS and representatives of the at-risk groups have been involved in discussions on the style and content of the campaign. Now, by this point in time, those who had been infected with HIV through blood products or through blood transfusion or through organ donation might not be described as at-risk groups. They had already been infected. Do you know whether there were any discussions held with representatives of those who'd been infected by that route on the style and content of the campaign?
Well, only in a general sense. I mean, you can't have. I mean, running a campaign is difficult enough without actually, and certainly running the advertisements is difficult enough without actually having a kind of great conflagration and people, a great combination of people around the table. And certainly, some of the bodies would have distinct views of their own. I mean, if I could give the example of one body which we did certainly take into account, well, the Haemophilia Society was one. Another one was Terence Higgins Trust. We certainly took their views into account as well. And we did, of course, create the National AIDS Trust, which was exactly to do the kind of things that you've been talking about.
Following the leaflets and print advertisements, posters and so on, the next stage of the campaign, as it were, was then the Don't Die of Ignorance campaign.
Yes.
And the television advertisements,
Yeah.
which are, I think it can probably fairly be said were unforgettable for those who saw them. The tombstone, which falls at the end, the voiceover by John Hurt, the lilies that fall onto the tombstone, the message, don't die of ignorance. Now, looking at that advert, looking at what you've said in the document on screen about the purpose of the campaign was aimed at deterring people from behaviour which might expose them to AIDS, in a nutshell, was it not?
Warning people. And actually getting their attention. I mean, you know, you can actually write, we started by writing wonderful long advertisements, which I don't think anyone, well, I think some people read, but they weren't very good, they weren't very striking. But what one wanted was advertisements that grabbed people's attention. Well, you know how difficult it is to get anyone's attention these days with everything that appears on television, and the same was true then. So we did need some sort of messages, some kind of messages, which did grab their attention. And as I think this report, the Market Bureau report shows, I mean, it was quite successful.
Those who'd been infected with HIV, not as a result of anything they'd done, but as a result of what had been done to them through blood products, was any consideration, conscious consideration at least, given on what the impact might be on them, this already vilified cohort, community, sitting at home, seeing an advert that would effectively spell out a death sentence, or might be seen as spelling out a death sentence to them, being told don't die of ignorance when they've already been infected through their NHS treatment with HIV? Was that impact considered at all?
Yes, that impact was considered. And a number of other issues of that kind were considered. And we tried to take a course which, as best we could, took that into account. But the number one priority was we were in a national emergency, was to warn the public that the dangers from HIV and AIDS were very substantial, and that they should take some notice of what we were saying. The whole purpose of the campaign was to actually tell people, read the leaflet that's come through, take some notice of what we're saying, don't just pass on. And I think they did, and I think all the figures show that they did. The knowledge of AIDS went up, the knowledge of what you could do went up. So that was the priority. But we tried to do it as best we could without, well, certainly not demonizing anyone with HIV and AIDS. I spent most of my time actually giving interviews and saying that this wasn't the purpose of what we were doing. But at times it must have appeared, I suppose, to some who had HIV that this was quite a difficult message. But it wasn't in any way an inaccurate message. I mean, we said that, some of the most famous advertisements we did, we said that it can be the death of you. Well, it could be the death of you. That was the trouble. There wasn't at this stage there certainly wasn't any cure. There isn't now. There weren't really any drugs, effective drugs for it. So, what would a sensible government want to do? I mean, you could, as they did in the United States, Ronald Reagan did in the United States, say nothing at all. And you had the most incredible epidemic as a result of that. Or you could try and take it head on. And we probably took it more head on than any other country in Europe, which is why I slightly bridled at your earlier international comparisons. And the effect was, it's estimated, we saved thousands of lives as a result of that. And so, you know, again, I'm not inclined to apologise for the campaign.
Just last question before the break, if I may, Lord Fowler.
Yeah.
I think you say in your statement you can't think of a middle way in which you could have achieved the objectives of the campaign in a way that was less dramatic, less bold. My next question is not about asking for an apology, but just exploring understanding. Do you understand the perspective of those parents sitting at home with young children who'd been infected with HIV from their treatment, families sitting at home with husbands and fathers who'd been infected, partners who had themselves been infected because their haemophiliac husband had been? Do you understand that for some of them at least, they have described a sense of fear that came from many sources, but the advertising campaign is a theme that's come up, and the Tombstone advert's a theme that's come up in some of the evidence the inquiry has heard, that it contributed to the sense of fear, the sense of isolation, the sense of vilification that they...
Yes, I do see it. Obviously I see that, and it has been put to me in a number of areas. I mean, not just with haemophiliacs, obviously. I mean, you have women who have been infected entirely with no fault, if fault is the right word, on them at all. And indeed, you might well say that, look, any of the HIV victims in the sexual area are without fault, because at vast periods of time in this campaign, no one knew how it was all caused and the rest. And they certainly didn't expect to get AIDS as a result. But the number one priority, I think, remained that we should try to prevent that fate overtaking other people. So we tried to prevent that fate overtaking other people, but at the same time respecting and defending. I was forever defending the position of people with HIV and AIDS. And I continue to do that, and will continue to do that for as long as I'm around. So I feel very strongly on this. But you have to make some choices. And the choice was, first and foremost, to actually prevent this epidemic going even further and further. And, you know, you could have taken that course. I mean, and we could have made less effective advertising. We could certainly have done that, and everyone would have said, you know, that's nice advertising. But whether it would have been effective or not is another matter. I think actually the advertising was extremely effective, and it played a very major part in reducing, as we've had in some of the evidence, reducing the incidence of AIDS below that of most other European countries, and certainly below that of the United States.
So I'll note the time. A few more questions on the issue of public education, but I can pick those up at 2 o'clock. 5 past 2.
5 past 2, I think.
Yes.
So 5 past 2.